This LOS is analyze the effect of combined changes in aggregate supply and demand on the economy. Okay, we're going to talk our way through this first, and then the next slide is going to have a little table to help us memorize it. So now we're going to be looking at when both the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, both curves move, okay? So there's four scenarios. Let's look at it first. Both aggregate demand and aggregate supply increase. Both aggregate demand and aggregate supply decrease. Aggregate demand increases and aggregate supply decreases. Or aggregate demand decreases and aggregate supply increases. So those are the four cases that we need to look at, okay? So the first one, when both aggregate demand and aggregate supply increase, if they both increase, real GDP will increase, but the impact on inflation is not clear unless we know the magnitude of the changes, because an increase in aggregate demand will increase the price level, whereas an increase in aggregate supply will decrease the price level. If aggregate demand increases more than aggregate supply, the price level will increase. Okay, so that makes sense. If aggregate supply increases more than aggregate demand, however, the price level will decline. Looking at the second case, when both aggregate demand and aggregate supply decrease, well, I think we can figure that out. If they're both increasing, GDP will increase. In this case, if they're both decreasing, real GDP and employment will decline. But again, the impact on price level is not clear unless we know the magnitude of the changes, because a decrease in aggregate demand decreases the price level, whereas a decrease in aggregate supply increases the price level. If aggregate demand decreases more than aggregate supply, of course, the price level will fall. But if aggregate supply decreases more than aggregate demand, the price level will rise, okay? Looking at the third case, it's when aggregate demand increases and aggregate demand supply decreases. If aggregate demand increases and aggregate supply declines, the price level will rise, but the effect on real GDP is not clear unless we know the magnitude of the changes, because an increase in aggregate demand increases real GDP, whereas a decrease in aggregate supply decreases real GDP. If aggregate demand increases more than aggregate supply declines, GDP will rise. If aggregate supply decreases more than aggregate demand increases, real GDP will fall. And finally, looking at the fourth case, where aggregate demand decreases as aggregate supply increases, if aggregate demand decreases and aggregate supply increases, the price level will decline. But again, the impact on real GDP is not clear unless we know the magnitude of the changes, because again, a decrease in aggregate demand decreases real GDP, whereas an increase in aggregate supply increases real GDP. If aggregate demand decreases more than aggregate supply, then real GDP will fall. If aggregate supply increases more than aggregate demand declines, real GDP will rise. So here's the table just summarizing. So here we have our changes in aggregate supply, changes in aggregate demand. Then we can see the effect on real GDP and the effect on the aggregate price level. So in the first case, when they're both increasing, there's an increase in real GDP, but the effect on the price level is indeterminate. We need to know the magnitude, whether aggregate supply is increasing more than aggregate demand, okay? The next case is when they're both decreasing, the effect on the real GDP is decreasing, but then again, the effect on the prices, we need to know the magnitude. Moving now where there's an increase in aggregate supply but decrease in aggregate demand, the price level will surely decrease, but we don't know the effect again on the real GDP unless we know the magnitude, okay? And finally, when the aggregate supply decreases, but the change in aggregate demand is an increase, again, we don't know the effect on the real GDP, but surely it's the opposite effect on the price level. The prices level will increase. Now we'll just do a quick practice question. The most likely outcome when both aggregate supply and aggregate demand increase is A, a rise in inflation, B, higher employment, or C, an increase in nominal GDP. Okay, so we just have to memorize this table again, but there's one little twist with this, because C is asking about an increase in a nominal GDP. And so when you read, both aggregate supply, aggregate demand increase, well, that's an increase in real GDP. You might be tempted to answer C, but it's not the right one. Now, with regards to the rise in inflation, Recall that the effect on the aggregate price level is indeterminate because we don't know the magnitude of the shift in aggregate supply, or aggregate demand. Okay, so B is correct. Higher aggregate demand and higher aggregate supply raise real GDP and lower unemployment, meaning employment levels increase. Well, because we're talking about employment and output, I put one last practice question in to finish this LOS. And the full employment or natural level of output is best described as A, the maximum level obtainable with existing resources, B, the level at which all available workers have jobs consistent with their skills, or C, a level with modest, stable pool of unemployed workers transitioning to new jobs. And the correct answer is C. At the full employment or natural level of output, the economy is operating at an efficient and unconstrained level of production. Companies have enough spare capacity to avoid bottlenecks, and there is modest, stable pool of unemployed workers, job seekers equal job vacancies, looking for and transitioning into new jobs. And that's the last slide for this LOS. Thank you.